In a small Michigan town, a police badge became a weapon, and an innocent man lost years of his life. But what began in betrayal and prison would unravel into one of the most unlikely stories of justice and forgiveness you'll ever hear. The story begins not in a courtroom, but in the shadows of a fractured American city. Benton Harbor, Michigan, once a thriving lakeside town, where factories hummed and families built dreams, now stood as a symbol of decline. Unemployment soared, streets crumbled, and trust in law enforcement had eroded after decades of tension between a mostly white police force and a largely black community. Here, survival was as much about navigating suspicion as it was about finding work. Against this backdrop, two men were set on a collision course. One, a rising police officer named Andrew Collins, young, ambitious, and eager to make a name for himself in narcotics enforcement. The other, a man called Jameel McGee, who carried not only the struggles of Benton Harbor on his shoulders, but also the scars of growing up amid poverty, fractured family life, and brushes with injustice. Their lives could not have been more different, yet destiny would intertwine them in a way neither could have predicted. For Andrew, the badge became both a symbol of authority and a dangerous addiction. Each arrest, each bust, each courtroom conviction fed his ego. He prided himself on his instincts, claiming he could spot a drug dealer just by the way a man stood on a street corner. And in a city like Benton Harbor, where poverty was often mistaken for guilt, those instincts became weapons. For Jameel, life had always been uphill. He dreamed of running his own business, and for a brief moment, he seemed on the cusp of achieving it. A car wash venture promised independence, a chance to provide for his son. But dreams are fragile when you live in a city where one wrong turn, one wrong association, can cost everything. It was February 2006 when their worlds collided. Jameel was simply trying to prepare for one of the most important days of his life, meeting his baby boy for the first time. He needed groceries, snacks, little things that would show he was ready to be a father. But he didn't have a license. A cousin's acquaintance offered him a ride to the store. Jameel thought nothing of it. A short trip, a few minutes at most. What he didn't know was that Andrew Collins was also out that day, fueled by the hunger to score a major bust. Collins had built his reputation by bending the rules, testifying to things he hadn't seen, tweaking reports to satisfy prosecutors, planting himself as a hero in a city desperate for law and order. That morning, he believed he was about to catch a major dealer known as Ox. Instead, he found Jameel. The moment was almost cinematic. Jameel stepping out of the store with a bag of groceries, a smile breaking across his face at the thought of finally meeting his son, only to be confronted by a plainclothes officer demanding, "Where's the dope?" Confusion turned quickly into a nightmare. Within minutes, Jameel was in handcuffs, accused of possessing and intending to distribute crack cocaine, drugs that were never his. His money was taken, his voice ignored, and the fragile hope of fatherhood was stolen before it even began. That arrest would cost Jameel 3 years of his life. It would brand him a criminal, tear him from his child, and ignite in him a fire of rage so deep that he swore, if he ever saw that cop again, he would kill him. But history has its ironies. That same officer, Andrew Collins, would later find himself disgraced, convicted not for a single bad call, but for a pattern of corruption that shook the very foundations of Benton Harbor's justice system. And in a twist few could imagine, these two men, once enemies locked in a cycle of injustice, would later stand side by side, not as rivals, but as friends. This is not just the story of a crooked cop and an innocent man. It is the story of a city scarred by inequality, of a justice system that failed, and of a journey toward forgiveness so improbable that it forces us to ask, what does redemption really look like? And so, our story begins on that February day in 2006, when a father's hope of holding his son collided with a police officer's obsession for a win. Neither man could see it then, but this single encounter would change them both forever. The ride to the police station was suffocating. Jameel sat in the back of the squad car, staring at the reflection of metal bars between himself and the world outside. His groceries, the bag of milk and snacks he had bought for his son, were left behind on the sidewalk. They would spoil in the cold February air, a small but devastating symbol of what had just been stolen from him. The officer driving, Andrew Collins, was calm, almost smug. For him, this was routine, another feather in his cap. He believed he had pulled off a significant bust, one that would echo through Benton Harbor's narcotics unit and draw attention from federal prosecutors. That was his game. Build his reputation, stack convictions, and climb the ladder. But Jameel wasn't just another name on a report. He was a man, a father, a son, someone who had already carried more than his fair share of burdens. And now, he was being dragged into a nightmare that would brand him as something he was not. Inside the station, the machinery of the system clicked into place. Fingerprints, mugshots, paperwork filled with accusations. It didn't matter that Jameel insisted he was innocent, that he had no drugs on him, that he didn't even own the vehicle in which they claimed to have found narcotics. His protests barely registered. To the officers, to the prosecutors, he was just another black man caught with drugs in Benton Harbor. Case closed. The irony was bitter. Years earlier, as a teenager, Jameel had already tasted the sting of injustice. A stolen car he hadn't known was stolen. Friends who made choices he hadn't made. A judge who dismissed his pleas and sentenced him as though he were hardened and dangerous. Prison had already taken chunks of his youth. He had fought to build something better, a car wash business, a future with his son. And now, the same story was repeating with devastating consequences. Meanwhile, Collins crafted his narrative. He wrote the report the way he had learned to, not to reflect the truth, but to secure a conviction. He adjusted details, changed names, filled in blanks with assumptions, and cut corners with confidence. Prosecutors didn't mind. They needed airtight cases. Judges rarely questioned the testimony of police officers. And the FBI, eager to pursue bigger fish, leaned on local officers like Collins to deliver arrests they could package into federal indictments. When the report was filed, it told a damning story. Jameel had been caught red-handed, connected to a large rock of crack cocaine, with intent to distribute. It was a story Collins knew would hold in court, especially with the weight of his badge behind it. Truth became malleable. Justice became secondary to winning. But for Jameel, this was no abstract legal battle. It was his life. In his cell, he replayed the day over and over. The ride to the store. The phone he had loaned to a man he barely knew. The groceries he had carried out with a smile. And then the badge, the handcuffs, the words possession with intent to distribute. Each detail cut deeper. He thought about his son, the little boy he hadn't yet met, and the possibility that years would pass before he could hold him. The rage built quickly. It was not just anger at Collins, though his name and face would burn in Jameel's memory. It was anger at the system that had marked him long before that day, the system that saw him as guilty before he even spoke. And as he lay in the silence of his cell, a vow took shape. If he ever crossed paths with that officer again, he would make him pay. While Jameel sat behind bars, Collins celebrated. At roll call, his colleagues slapped him on the back. Prosecutors nodded in approval. He was the golden boy, the officer who delivered big arrests. What no one saw or chose not to see was the foundation of lies beneath his victories. For Benton Harbor, it was just another day, another arrest. But for two men, the trajectory of their lives had been irreversibly altered. One man's ego-driven ambition had stolen another man's freedom. And somewhere, a child would grow up without his father, all because of a lie written on a police report. In the weeks that followed, Jameel prepared for trial, still clinging to the belief that evidence would save him. The surveillance camera outside the store, the inconsistencies in the report, the fact that the drugs weren't his. But what he didn't yet understand was that in a system rigged against him, the truth mattered far less than the story that Collins had already written. And so, the stage was set. A wrongful conviction looming, a crooked cop ascending, and a city too fractured to notice the injustice unfolding in its own backyard. Courtrooms have their own rhythm, slow, methodical, sometimes indifferent. For Jameel McGee, stepping into that space felt like entering a theater where the script had already been written and his role had been decided. Defendant, guilty until proven otherwise. He walked in wearing the standard orange jumpsuit, shackled like a dangerous criminal. To the jury, that image alone carried weight. To them, he didn't look like a young man building a business, dreaming of fatherhood. He looked like the stereotype that so many had been conditioned to expect. Another black man in Benton Harbor caught with drugs. Andrew Collins, by contrast, carried the aura of credibility. He wore a suit. He spoke with authority. He wielded the badge of the Benton Harbor Police Department as if it were a shield against scrutiny. When he testified, he did so with the confidence of someone who knew how to tell a convincing story. The prosecutor leaned on Collins heavily, presenting him as a trusted officer who had caught Jameel in the act. The narrative was airtight, or at least it appeared so. Collins had written the report carefully, smoothing over inconsistencies, framing Jameel as the central figure in the drug deal. And with the prosecutor guiding the jury, the case looked strong. Jameel's defense attorney fought back, but the tools were limited. Evidence that could have cleared him, like the store's surveillance footage, somehow never made it into consideration. Witnesses who could have contradicted the police report were dismissed or discredited. And when it came down to his word against that of a police officer, the jury was always going to believe the badge. The verdict came quickly. Guilty. Possession with intent to distribute. The words echoed in Jameel's ears like a sentence not just against him, but against every dream he had carried into that courtroom. The gavel came down, and with it, the door to his future seemed to slam shut. When the judge pronounced the sentence, Jameel barely heard it. Years, 3 long years. Time that would be stolen from him. Time that could never be returned. His son would grow up without him. His car wash dream would vanish. His name would forever be marked by a conviction that wasn't his to bear. For Collins, the case was another success story. Another tally mark on the board. Another step toward recognition and advancement. In his world, it didn't matter whether Jameel was truly guilty. What mattered was the appearance of guilt, the numbers that prosecutors could point to, the headlines that suggested Benton Harbor's drug problem was being handled. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Collins had built his career on lies. Small manipulations at first, later outright fabrications. He believed he was doing what needed to be done, but each false report, each planted narrative, chipped away at the foundation of justice. And while the system cheered his results, corruption was seeping deeper into every corner of his work. For Jameel, prison was both punishment and crucible. The walls closed in, but his anger burned brighter. He thought of his son every day. He thought of the officer who had stolen his freedom, and the vow he had made, to kill Collins if he ever saw him again, hardened into something cold and unshakable. But prison also had its paradoxes. In the silence of his cell, in the chapel services held behind bars, Jameel found moments of reflection. He wrestled with faith, with the teachings he had half ignored as a child, with the possibility that there could still be meaning in the middle of his suffering. Rage and hope battled inside him daily, each vying for control. The years dragged on. Outside, Collins continued to climb, his reputation as a narcotics officer growing stronger. Inside, Jameel counted days, each one stolen by a lie. It seemed impossible then, but one day, their stories would collide again. Not in a courtroom, not on a street corner, but in a way that neither man could have foreseen. A cop and the man he wrongfully put away, standing face to face, with nothing but truth and forgiveness between them. But before that day could come, the system itself would have to reckon with Andrew Collins's corruption. Because while Jameel sat in a cell as an innocent man, Collins's house of cards was already beginning to wobble. Prison changes a man. For Jameel, every day behind bars was a reminder that freedom had been stolen, not lost. He wasn't there because of choices he made, but because of choices someone else had made for him. A cop's lies, a system's indifference. That knowledge burned. At first, the anger carried him. It gave him energy, sharpened his senses, kept him on guard. He learned quickly how to survive in prison. Keep your head up, don't show weakness, don't let anger spill into foolish fights that could earn more time. But beneath the survival instincts, a storm raged. He thought constantly about his son. The boy was out there, growing up without him, learning to walk, learning to talk, living years of milestones that Jameel could only imagine. He had missed his first birthday, his first words, his first everything. That loss was heavier than any chain. And then there was the vow, the promise he had whispered to himself. If I ever see that cop again, I'll kill him. The thought, repeated like a mantra, fueled him even as he tried to wrestle with faith. Some nights he opened his Bible, searching for meaning, for an answer to the pain. Other nights, he clenched his fists and replayed the arrest in his mind, fantasizing about revenge. He lived in that tension, torn between rage and redemption. Meanwhile, Andrew Collins was living a very different reality. To the outside world, he was the star narcotics officer in Benton Harbor. His arrests were praised, his cases celebrated. Prosecutors leaned on him, judges trusted him, and his department pointed to him as proof that they were winning the war on drugs. But Collins was addicted, not to narcotics, but to power, to the thrill of being the man who delivered results. He had learned that a well-written report could smooth over cracks in a case. That if a suspect dropped drugs during a chase, he could testify to having seen it. That if a prosecutor hinted at what was needed, he could bend the facts to match. Each lie became easier than the last. At first, it felt justified. After all, he told himself, most of these guys were guilty anyway. The drugs would have been theirs sooner or later. What did it matter if the paperwork wasn't perfect? But as the years went on, the lies grew bolder. Evidence was shifted. Testimony was crafted to fit the desired outcome. And Collins got better at hiding it. Until he didn't. Behind closed doors, whispers began. Some colleagues noticed inconsistencies. Defense attorneys raised questions that didn't quite add up. And then the federal authorities, the very people Collins thought he was impressing, began to look closer. The FBI had their eyes on Benton Harbor, not just for its drug trade, but for the possibility of corruption inside the very department meant to police it. For Collins, the walls started closing in. His confidence remained on the outside, but inside, cracks were spreading. He knew he had crossed lines. He knew he had written reports that wouldn't survive scrutiny. He had built his career on sand, and the tide was beginning to rise. Back in prison, Jameel didn't know any of this. He only knew that his life had been derailed by one man's ambition. Each day he prayed for strength and yet plotted vengeance. Each day he told himself he was surviving for his son, even as bitterness gnawed at him. 2 men. One behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. One in uniform, hiding behind lies. Both caught in cycles they couldn't escape. And yet, fate was moving them toward a reckoning. Because eventually, the truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface. And when it did, it wouldn't just expose Andrew Collins. It would shake the very foundation of Benton Harbor's justice system. The collapse of a man's life doesn't always begin with a bang. Sometimes it starts with a whisper. For Andrew Collins, the whispers came from places he thought he had secured. Colleagues who noticed details that didn't align, prosecutors who wondered why his cases were always so neatly packaged, defense attorneys who pushed just a little harder on cross-examination. At first, Collins brushed it off. He was confident. He had survived years of bending the truth without consequence. He believed he was untouchable. After all, he was the officer everyone trusted, the one who delivered results when others came up short. But behind the scenes, the FBI had questions. They had been watching Benton Harbor for some time, not just the drug trade, but the patterns inside its police department. Reports kept surfacing about misconduct, racial profiling, and questionable arrests. And one officer's name kept appearing at the center of the stories: Andrew Collins. The investigation began quietly. Files were reviewed. Reports were compared. Evidence chains were scrutinized. And the more they looked, the more inconsistencies they found. Dates that didn't match. Witness accounts that conflicted. Arrest reports that seemed almost too convenient. For Collins, the turning point came when fellow officers were called in for questioning. Some had worked alongside him long enough to know his methods weren't always clean. Others, under pressure, admitted that things didn't always happen the way the paperwork said they did. One crack led to another, and soon the whole facade began to crumble. The FBI's findings were damning. Collins hadn't just bent the rules, he had shattered them. Evidence was planted. Reports were falsified. Testimony was fabricated. Entire convictions rested on lies. The very badge he wore, the one meant to protect and serve, had become a weapon of deceit. When federal agents confronted him, the weight of it all hit at once. His career was over, his reputation destroyed, and now he was the one facing charges, not the men he had arrested but himself. The courtroom that once applauded him as a star witness now stood as his judgment hall. Reporters filled the benches. Former colleagues looked on with a mix of disbelief and vindication. And in a twist of irony, Andrew Collins found himself on the other side of the justice system. The accused, the disgraced, the fallen. The sentence was swift. Prison time. Not decades, not the kind of sentence he had helped secure for others, but long enough to strip him of the life he had built. Long enough to leave him with nothing but the consequences of his actions. As the cell door clanged shut behind him, Collins felt the weight of his choices in a way he never had before. Nobody. No authority. No crowd to cheer his victories. Just silence, walls, and the knowledge that he had traded truth for ambition and lost. Back in Benton Harbor, the news spread quickly. To many residents, it was validation of what they had always believed. The system was rigged, the cops couldn't be trusted, and justice was a game played by those in power. To others, it was just another headline in a city too familiar with disappointment. But to one man, sitting in his own cell, it was something else entirely. Jameel McGee heard about Collins's downfall and felt a jolt of recognition. The cop who had stolen his life was now behind bars himself. For a moment, it felt like vindication, like the universe had finally tilted back toward justice. And yet, even as Jameel processed the news, the rage inside him didn't vanish. Because the truth was, Collins's prison sentence couldn't return the years he had lost. It couldn't give him back the first steps of his son, the laughter of milestones missed, the dreams of a business destroyed. Two men now both prisoners. One guilty of crimes committed in uniform. One innocent trapped by those very crimes. Their stories had run parallel, shaped by lies and injustice. And soon, those parallel lines would converge in a way neither man could have imagined. Freedom. The word had echoed in Jameel's mind for years, a promise he clung to through the long nights in prison. But when the gates finally opened and he stepped back into the world, it didn't feel like freedom at all. The air was fresher, yes, the sky wider, but everything else carried the invisible weight of his conviction. On paper, he was still a felon, branded, marked, limited. Employers saw the record before they saw the man. Neighbors whispered. Old friends kept their distance. Prison had followed him home, clinging to him like a shadow. He returned to Benton Harbor with nothing. The car-wash dream had evaporated. His savings were gone. His name carried a stain that no explanation could wash away. And most painfully, his son had grown up without him. The boy was no longer the toddler Jameel had imagined meeting. He was older now, with years of memories Jameel hadn't been part of. Trying to reconnect was like trying to bridge an ocean. Everywhere he turned, he saw reminders of what had been stolen. Jobs were scarce. Trust was scarce. Hope was scarce. For a while, bitterness became his constant companion. He replayed the vow he had made in prison. If I ever see that cop again, I'll kill him. The thought burned hotter now that Collins himself had fallen. It wasn't enough that the man was in prison too. Jameel wanted him to feel the same emptiness, the same hollow ache of years lost. But even as anger threatened to consume him, small flickers of something else broke through. Faith had never fully left him. The scriptures he had clung to in prison still whispered in his heart, even when he tried to ignore them. Verses about forgiveness, about mercy, about leaving vengeance in God's hands. He hated those verses, and yet they refused to leave him alone. Life outside was a constant tug of war. One day he would rage against the injustice, ready to explode. The next he would kneel in quiet prayer, asking for the strength to endure. He didn't know which side of him would win. Meanwhile, Andrew Collins was living his own version of that struggle behind bars. Stripped of the badge, stripped of the respect he once commanded, He now knew what it was to be caged. He too wrestled with shame, regret, and a gnawing emptiness. But unlike Jameel, Collins had chosen his path. The lies, the corruption, the pride, all of it had been his decision. And now he had no choice but to face it. For years, the two men lived separate lives of brokenness, each trying to find a way forward. They didn't know it yet, but the city that had torn them apart would one day bring them back together. Their meeting wouldn't happen in a courtroom or a prison yard, but in the most unlikely of places, a church park event filled with laughter, music, and children. That day was still ahead. For now, Jameel carried the heavy burden of rebuilding a life from ashes, while Collins grappled with the ruins of his own downfall. Both men were at rock bottom, and sometimes it's only at rock bottom that the ground is finally solid enough to start building something new. The summer air in Benton Harbor was heavy, filled with the sounds of children laughing and the steady thump of bass from speakers set up in Broadway Park. It was a community gathering, hoops, hot dogs, and hip-hop. A church-sponsored event meant to bring life and joy to a city that had seen far too much pain. Families lined up for food. Kids dribbled basketballs on cracked pavement. Music pulsed through the crowd, mixing with the smell of grilled hot dogs and the faint sweetness of cotton candy. Felt, for once, like a celebration. But in the middle of it all, a storm was brewing. Jameel was there, trying to enjoy the day with his young son. The boy's eyes lit up at the sight of snow cones and swing sets, his laughter a small reminder of what Jameel had missed and what he still longed to protect. But for Jameel, joy was fragile. His heart was still heavy, his past never far away. And then he saw him. Across the park, moving through the crowd, was a face he could never forget: Andrew Collins. The man who had stolen 3 years of his life. The cop who had branded him a criminal. The reason he had missed his son's first steps, first words, first everything. The sight was like a spark dropped onto dry timber. Rage flared instantly. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched. He began to walk. Not slowly, not casually, but with purpose. The crowd seemed to sense it, parting instinctively as he pushed forward. His son trailed behind, struggling to keep up. Another man, a friend, hurried alongside, his eyes wide with fear at what was about to happen. Collins saw him coming. He recognized the face too, though it took him a moment to put a name to it. When it came Jameel McGee, his stomach sank. He knew this moment had been inevitable. He had prepared for it in his mind, rehearsed what he might say, imagined the anger he would face. And now here it was. Jameel walked straight up to him, eyes burning, and stuck out his hand. It wasn't a gesture of peace. It was a test, a challenge. Collins hesitated, then took it. Jameel's grip tightened, crushing, unyielding. Pain shot through Collins's hand, but he didn't pull away. "Remember me?" Jameel said, his voice low, edged with threat. Collins swallowed hard. "Jameel McGee," he answered. The grip tightened further, bones grinding. Jameel's jaw clenched, his muscles flexing. The air between them was electric, charged with years of injustice and rage. The friend beside Jameel looked terrified. Collins glanced toward the boy at Jameel's side, the son he had never seen grow up, and prayed his own daughter, playing somewhere nearby, wouldn't witness what was about to unfold. Collins did the only thing he could think of. He spoke. His words stumbled at first, but they poured out. An apology, raw and unpolished. "Jameel, man, I'm so sorry for what I did to you. Back then, I was messed up. I was addicted to my own ego, to making a name for myself. I ruined lives, including yours. I can't take it back, but I need you to know I regret it." Jameel's face didn't change. His grip didn't loosen. He stared at Collins like he was staring at the man who had stolen his very soul. Then he nodded toward his son. His voice cracked, heavy with pain. "Tell him why his daddy missed 3 years of his life." The words cut deeper than any fist could have. Collins froze. What could he say? How do you explain to a child that his father was taken because of a lie? That his absence wasn't his fault, but the result of another man's corruption? Collins's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Shame swallowed every word. In that moment, Collins felt smaller than he ever had before. He wanted to vanish, to run, to escape the judgment burning in Jameel's eyes. But he stayed. He stood in the fire, knowing he deserved every ounce of the man's anger. The grip remained tight, the silence stretched. Around them, the music played on, children laughed, snow cones melted in the sun. But between these two men, time had stopped. It was the moment everything could have exploded, years of rage released in one violent act. And yet, somehow, it didn't. The war inside Jameel raged on, the vow for vengeance against the pull of faith, the urge to destroy against the whisper of forgiveness. In that park, with his son watching, Jameel stood on the razor's edge of decision. What he chose in that moment would change not just his life, not just Collins's life, but the future of both men. The world seemed to hold its breath. Jameel's grip was iron, his anger radiating through every vein in his body. For 3 years he had dreamed of this moment, standing face to face with the cop who had stolen his life. He had imagined throwing punches, imagined breaking him, imagined finally evening the scales. And now, with Andrew Collins's hand trapped in his own, he had the power to do it. But something unexpected happened. As he stared at Collins, as he looked into the eyes of the man who had lied, who had written him into a cell, Jameel didn't just see the cop. He saw a broken man. He saw shame flicker across Collins's face, saw the weight of guilt pressing on his shoulders. For the first time, Jameel wondered if hurting him, truly hurting him, would bring any peace at all. His son stood nearby, watching, wide-eyed, innocent, too young to understand the full story but old enough to sense the danger. In that moment, Jameel realized this wasn't just about him anymore. His son was learning who his father was by how he acted now. Would he see a man consumed by revenge, or a man strong enough to choose differently? The war inside Jameel raged. His jaw clenched, his muscles ached from holding the tension. Finally, with a sharp breath, he loosened his grip. He didn't let go entirely, but he pulled back just enough to release the violence he had been holding in his bones. Collins felt the shift instantly, relief flooding him, though he knew he didn't deserve it. He stood silent, waiting, uncertain if the reprieve would last. Jameel looked at him one last time, then turned his gaze back to his son. "Let's go," he said quietly. And just like that, he released Collins's hand and walked away. The crowd, which had been frozen in anticipation, exhaled. Conversations resumed. The music swelled again. It was as if nothing had happened. But for both men, everything had changed. For Collins, the moment cut deeper than any prison sentence. He had faced one of the men he had wronged, looked into his eyes, and heard the truth spoken plainly. "Tell my son why I missed 3 years of his life." Those words would echo in his soul for years to come. For Jameel, the release was both victory and torment. He hadn't killed Collins, hadn't lashed out, hadn't fulfilled the vow he had made in prison. In some ways, that felt like weakness. But in another sense, it was strength, the kind that came not from fists but from restraint. He didn't know it yet, but that choice had opened the door to something bigger than revenge. Neither man could have imagined that this moment, tense and fragile as it was, would be the beginning of an improbable journey toward forgiveness. A journey that would one day transform not just their lives, but the lives of others who heard their story. But forgiveness is never a straight path. It would take time. It would take setbacks, raw conversations, and the painful work of confronting the past. For now, it was just a beginning. Two men scarred by injustice, standing on opposite sides of a wound that seemed impossible to heal. The days after Broadway Park were heavy. Jameel replayed the moment again and again in his mind. The grip, the stare, the apology, the words he had thrown at Collins like a spear. Tell my son why his daddy missed 3 years of his life. He could still feel the tension in his hand, the fire in his chest, the split-second choice not to lash out. Part of him wondered if he had failed. For years, vengeance had been his anchor. To finally stand face to face with Andrew Collins and walk away, it didn't feel like justice, felt unfinished. But another part of him knew something had shifted. He had chosen restraint, not out of weakness, but out of strength. His son had seen it, The crowd had seen it, and though he wouldn't admit it yet, Jameel himself had felt it. Collins, meanwhile, was shaken. He had prepared for confrontation, but nothing could have prepared him for Jameel's words. That question, directed at his son, had pierced him to the core. It wasn't just about the lies he had told or the evidence he had planted. It was about the human cost, the real lives torn apart. And now he couldn't escape it. He went home from that park carrying a weight he couldn't shrug off. He had already lost his career, his reputation, and his freedom once. But this was different. This was deeper. Now he was being forced to look at the wreckage he had caused, not as a police officer, not as a defendant, but as a man. For weeks, their lives continued on separate paths. Benton Harbor was a small city, but they didn't cross again right away. Still, the encounter lingered for both men, gnawing at them, forcing them to wrestle with questions neither wanted to face. For Jameel, the questions sounded like this. Could he ever truly let go of what had been done to him? Could he ever forgive? What would that even mean, and why should he? For Collins, the questions were different. Was there any way to make things right? Was forgiveness even possible? Could a man who had built his career on lies ever find redemption? The answers didn't come quickly. They came in slow steps, a chance meeting here, a brief conversation there. At first, the exchanges were stiff, guarded, almost painful. Collins apologized again, fumbling, repeating himself, desperate to be heard. Jameel listened with folded arms, skeptical, unwilling to grant even a sliver of trust. But over time, something began to change. Collins stopped trying to defend himself. He stopped explaining, stopped making excuses. He began to own his wrongdoing fully and without condition. He said the words plainly, "I was wrong. I hurt you. I can't take it back." And Jameel, though still wounded, found that hearing the truth spoken aloud began to chip away at the wall he had built. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a crack in the armor. And in that crack, the smallest seed of something new began to grow. Neither man could see it clearly then. To Jameel, it was just exhaustion, the weariness of carrying anger so heavy it crushed him. To Collins, it was desperation, a need for grace he knew he didn't deserve. But together, step by step, word by word, they were moving toward a road neither had ever thought possible. The road to forgiveness. Forgiveness doesn't happen in a single moment. It unfolds slowly, like dawn breaking after a long night. For Jameel and Andrew, the first light came in small, almost reluctant conversations. They weren't planned meetings. Sometimes it was a mutual friend drawing them into the same room. Sometimes it was a church event, a gathering where their paths crossed unexpectedly. At first, each encounter felt like a test. Could they stand side by side without the tension boiling over? Could they speak without anger sharpening every word? For Jameel, every interaction reopened wounds. He would hear Collins speak, soft, apologetic, humbled, and part of him wanted to believe it. But another part screamed that belief was dangerous. Belief was what had betrayed him in the courtroom years before. Trusting the system, trusting the badge, had cost him 3 years of freedom. Trusting this man could cost him even more. For Collins, every word was a plea, not for sympathy, but for the chance to make amends. He stopped trying to explain himself, stopped reaching for excuses about pressure, about the culture of the department, about how everyone was doing it. Instead, he began to speak simply, "I lied. I hurt you. I stole your life." Those words landed differently. They didn't erase the pain, but they acknowledged it. And in a city where so many wounds had gone unacknowledged, that mattered. Still, the journey was not smooth. There were days when Jameel couldn't bear to hear Collins's voice. Days when anger surged back to the surface, and the vow he had once made in prison seemed to whisper again. You should have finished it when you had the chance. And there were days when Collins wondered if this was hopeless, if forgiveness was too much to ask, if some wounds were simply too deep to heal. But then there were moments, fragile, fleeting, when something shifted. One came when Collins admitted, with tears in his eyes, that his own daughter had suffered because of his choices. "I missed 1.5 years of her life," he said quietly, "and it was my fault." For Jameel, the comparison stung. 3 years of his son's life had been stolen, and not by his own doing, but by Collins's lies. Yet, for the first time, he saw Collins not as the untouchable cop, but as a father who had also lost something precious. It wasn't the same, not even close, but it was a point of connection, a reminder that they were both men, both fathers, both broken in different ways. Another moment came when Jameel admitted his own struggle, not just with anger, but with the weight of carrying it. "Hating you," he said one day, "is like drinking poison and waiting for you to die." The words surprised even him. They had been buried in his chest for years, festering. Speaking them aloud was both confession and release. Collins didn't respond with defense. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, tears slipping down his face, because he knew it was true. These were not easy conversations. They were raw, jagged, filled with long silences and sharp edges. But they were real, and in their honesty, something new began to grow. Not trust yet, not reconciliation, but the faintest outline of a bridge being built across the chasm. In Benton Harbor, people began to notice. Two men who should have been enemies, who had every reason to despise each other, were beginning to stand in the same spaces, sometimes even speaking together. At first, whispers spread, disbelief, skepticism, even mockery. But as time went on, those whispers turned into curiosity. Could it be true? Could forgiveness really happen here, in a city where bitterness and division had reigned for so long? The answer was still far away. Forgiveness was not yet complete, but the journey had begun. And sometimes, beginning is the hardest step of all. At first, their conversations stayed private. Cautious exchanges, tentative moments where wounds were revisited and apologies repeated. But word has a way of traveling in a small city like Benton Harbor. People began to notice. Whispers spread. Jameel McGee and Andrew Collins, in the same room, talking? The idea sounded impossible. To many, it sounded wrong. Why should an innocent man give the crooked cop who stole his freedom even a moment of his time? Why should he let himself be seen near him, much less speaking with him? Jameel wrestled with those questions himself. Friends warned him not to trust it. Family shook their heads. Some said forgiveness was weakness, that it let Collins off too easy. And deep down, Jameel understood. Forgiving didn't erase the prison years. It didn't bring back the birthdays he'd missed with his son. It didn't erase the pain of walking out of prison with nothing. But something in him knew that holding on to the rage was killing him slowly. Every time he clenched his fists at the thought of Collins, every time the vow for vengeance replayed in his head, it chained him all over again. Forgiveness wasn't about letting Collins off the hook. It was about letting himself go free. Collins, on the other hand, carried his own burden of doubt. He knew how people saw him. A disgraced cop, a liar, a man who had betrayed his badge and his community. Standing next to Jameel in public only magnified that shame. And yet, it also became a strange kind of redemption. The fact that Jameel was even willing to stand near him was proof that change, however small, was possible. The first time they shared their story publicly, it wasn't planned. It happened at a church gathering, when someone asked them both to speak. Collins spoke first, voice trembling, laying bare his corruption, his lies, his downfall. He confessed it openly, without excuse. Then he turned to Jameel and said, "This is the man I hurt the most." All eyes shifted to Jameel. The room was silent, waiting. He could have unleashed his anger right there. He could have humiliated Collins, exposed him again, reminded everyone of what had been stolen. Instead, Jameel took a breath and said simply, "He ruined my life, but I'm choosing not to let hate ruin me anymore." The room gasped. Some wept. Others shook their heads in disbelief. But no one could deny what they had just witnessed. A glimpse of grace, raw and unpolished, right there in front of them. From that day, doors began to open. Churches invited them to speak. Community groups wanted to hear their story. Reporters started calling. And slowly, what had once been a story of corruption and injustice began to transform into a story of reconciliation. But the journey was far from easy. Every time Jameel stood beside Collins, the old anger tugged at him. Every time Collins told his story, shame threatened to choke him. Forgiveness wasn't a single act. It was a daily choice. Some days that choice came easier. Other days it felt impossible. And yet, together they kept showing up, kept telling the truth, kept standing side by side, not as enemies, not yet fully as friends, but as two men who had decided that their story could mean more than their pain. What neither of them knew was just how far that story would travel, and how many lives it would touch. The first time Jameel and Andrew shared a stage together, it felt surreal. One man had once stood in a courtroom to testify against the other. Now, years later, they stood shoulder to shoulder, telling the same story, not of guilt and conviction, but of injustice, repentance, and the fragile beginnings of forgiveness. At first, it was just local churches, small gatherings where people sat on folding chairs and leaned forward, hanging on every word. The reactions were mixed. Some wept openly, moved by the courage it took for Jameel to forgive. Others shifted uneasily, wondering how anyone could stand next to the man who had ruined his life. For Collins, every telling was a wound reopened. He had to stand there, again and again, admitting what he had done. Falsifying reports, planting lies, sending innocent men to prison, and most painfully, sending Jameel away from his son. Each confession felt like tearing off a scab, but he knew it was necessary. The truth had to be spoken if healing was to mean anything. For Jameel, speaking was just as hard. Every word forced him to relive the years he had lost. Every retelling brought back the cold walls of his cell, the ache of birthdays missed, the hollow silence of being called inmate instead of dad. Some nights, after speaking, he went home exhausted, wrung out, wondering if forgiveness was really worth the cost. And yet, each time they shared, something remarkable happened. People leaned in. People listened. People began to see that forgiveness wasn't weakness, wasn't denial of justice. It was freedom. It was choosing not to be defined by bitterness. Word spread quickly. Local newspapers wrote about them. Radio stations invited them in for interviews. Before long, larger platforms were calling. Conferences, organizations, even national outlets wanting to hear the story of the crooked cop and the innocent man who found a way forward together. The attention was overwhelming. Cameras followed them. Reporters scribbled notes. Headlines captured the paradox. Convict forgives cop who framed him. But with attention came pressure. For Jameel, there was the constant suspicion that people were using his pain for inspiration without understanding the depth of the wound. Some days, he wondered if audiences saw him as a symbol more than a man, a living example of forgiveness, instead of a father still aching for years he could never recover. For Collins, the shame was magnified. Every stage, every microphone, every camera forced him to declare again the depth of his corruption. There was no escaping his past. It followed him into every room. And though he was speaking about grace and redemption, he knew many people still saw him as nothing more than a crooked cop in a suit. And yet, the more they spoke, the clearer their purpose became. Their story wasn't about erasing the past or pretending it didn't hurt. It was about showing that healing was possible. Not easy, not instant, but possible. Together, they became unlikely messengers. In schools, they told young people about the cost of choices. Choices that could steal freedom. Choices that could destroy trust. In churches, they spoke about grace. In community centers, they stood as proof that cycles of hate didn't have to last forever. Their journey wasn't polished. It wasn't neat. Sometimes Jameel's voice would crack with anger. Sometimes Collins's words would stumble under the weight of guilt. But that rawness was what made their story real. And slowly, their message began to spread beyond Benton Harbor. People across the country began to hear about the cop and the man he framed. Not just as a story of corruption, but as a story of what forgiveness can build when bitterness could have destroyed everything. It was never easy. It was never simple, but it was changing lives. And in the process, it was changing them too. At first, their partnership was more practical than personal. They told their story together because people wanted to hear it, because doors kept opening, because standing side by side made the message more powerful than either man could deliver alone. But beneath the public appearances, trust was still fragile. After events, Jameel often drove home in silence, his son asleep in the back seat, the words replaying in his mind. He had forgiven Collins with his lips, but his heart still wrestled. How do you truly trust a man who once wrote lies that caged you? How do you share a stage with the one who stole years from your child? Forgiveness was one thing, friendship was another. For Collins, the struggle was different. Every time he stood beside Jameel, he was reminded of the weight of his guilt. And yet, being near him also became a strange kind of refuge. Jameel had every right to hate him, to expose him, to refuse him. But instead, he kept showing up. And that, more than anything, gave Collins hope that maybe redemption wasn't just a word. It was small things that began to shift their relationship. A quiet conversation on a long drive to a speaking event. A shared meal afterward, laughter breaking through unexpectedly. Jameel's son calling Collins Mr. Andrew one afternoon, without fear, without hesitation. The first time Jameel invited Collins into his home, it was awkward. The walls still held the memories of absence, the years of emptiness when Jameel should have been there but wasn't. And now, the man responsible for that absence was sitting at his table. But as they talked, something softened. Collins asked about Jameel's son, not as a stage story, but with genuine interest. He listened as Jameel shared his hopes, his struggles, his fears, and Jameel began to see something he hadn't expected. Collins wasn't just sorry, he was different. The arrogance that once fueled him as a cop was gone. The addiction to power, the swagger of authority, had been stripped away. What sat across from him now was a humbled man, broken, but trying to rebuild. Trust didn't happen overnight, came piece by piece. Collins showed up when he said he would. He kept his word. He didn't shy away from hard conversations. Slowly, Jameel's guarded stance began to ease. One evening, after another long day of speaking, the two men sat outside, the night air cool and quiet. For the first time, Collins called Jameel not man or brother, but by his full name, with respect. "Jameel," he said, voice steady, "you have every reason to hate me, every reason to never sit here with me. But the fact that you do, that you let me be here, that's grace. And I'll never stop being grateful for it." Jameel didn't respond right away. He stared off into the distance, his thoughts heavy. Finally, he said quietly, "I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for me, for my boy, for God. But maybe that's enough." It wasn't friendship yet, not fully. But it was something stronger than tolerance, something deeper than cooperation. It was the beginnings of brotherhood, born not out of shared success, but out of shared brokenness. And over time, that bond would grow, not just into forgiveness, but into a friendship that neither man could have imagined the day they first locked eyes across Broadway Park. Friendship isn't forged in the easy moments. It's tested in the valleys, in the setbacks, the doubts, the days when old wounds whisper again. For Jameel and Andrew, those whispers never fully went away. There were still mornings when Jameel woke up angry, memories of prison flashing across his mind. He'd see the face of the judge, hear the sound of the cell door slamming shut, and feel bitterness rising like bile. Forgiveness, he learned, was a decision he had to make again and again. Some days it was easier, other days it felt impossible. And there were still nights when Collins lay awake, haunted by the faces of men he had framed, by the families he had broken apart, by the hollow sound of his own daughter's voice asking why he hadn't been there. Even as he stood on stages proclaiming redemption, shame followed him home like a shadow. Yet in those valleys they found each other. One day, Jameel received devastating news. His son had been caught up in trouble at school. The boy, carrying the weight of a fractured childhood, lashed out in anger. For Jameel, it felt like history repeating itself, the system circling again, threatening to pull another McGee into its grip. Overwhelmed, he called the one person he never would have imagined turning to, Andrew Collins. Collins didn't hesitate. He showed up, sat with Jameel, and listened. He didn't offer easy answers, didn't pretend to know the pain of watching his son stumble. But he stayed. And sometimes, presence is the greatest gift a friend can give. Another time, Collins's past came crashing back. A news article resurfaced, detailing his corruption, painting him again as the disgraced officer who had betrayed his badge. Online comments piled up with venom. Crooked cop. Can't change. Once a liar, always a liar. He felt the shame pressing in, threatening to suffocate him. It was Jameel who called that night. His voice was steady, almost stern. Don't you dare give up. You messed up, yeah, but you're not the same man you were. Don't let their words make you forget that. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The man once framed was now defending the man who framed him. But that's how forgiveness works. It doesn't just free the victim, it frees the offender too. Their bond deepened through shared struggle, but also through shared joy. They began spending time not just on stages or in interviews, but in life. Cookouts, family gatherings, basketball games in the park. Jameel's son grew comfortable around Collins. Collins's daughter began to call Jameel Uncle Jameel. Slowly, what had begun as an unlikely partnership began to feel like family. Not everyone understood. Some in Benton Harbor still looked at them with suspicion. Some said Jameel had betrayed his community by forgiving too easily. Others said Collins was using forgiveness to polish his image. But the two men pressed on, knowing their story wasn't about pleasing everyone. It was about walking in the freedom they had found. One evening, after speaking at a packed auditorium, they sat backstage together, exhausted. Collins looked at Jameel and said, "I don't deserve this friendship." Jameel shook his head. "Neither do I. That's the point. Forgiveness isn't about what we deserve. It's about what we choose." And with that, the crooked cop and the innocent man, once enemies locked on opposite sides of injustice, found themselves bound together by something far stronger than hate. Grace, grit, and the choice to walk as brothers. By now, Benton Harbor knew their story. The city had watched the arc unfold, from betrayal to confrontation to the fragile beginnings of reconciliation. But beyond Michigan, the world was beginning to take notice. It started with a regional newspaper picking up their story. The headline was bold: "Framed Man Forgives Crooked Cop." The piece spread quickly online, shared across social media, stirring both awe and outrage. Some readers called it a miracle. Others dismissed it as naive. But no one ignored it. Soon after, a television crew arrived. Cameras rolled as Jameel and Andrew sat side by side, recounting the lies, the prison years, the confrontation in Broadway Park, and the slow climb toward forgiveness. For Collins, the exposure was excruciating. Every broadcast meant confessing again, in front of strangers, the darkest chapters of his life. For Jameel, it meant reopening wounds, laying bare his pain for audiences who would never fully grasp the depth of it. But the impact was undeniable. Letters began arriving. Strangers wrote to say that hearing their story had given them courage to forgive, to let go, to believe that change was possible. Families estranged for decades found hope. Fathers reconciled with children. Addicts sought recovery. Their story resonated because it was real, unpolished, raw, still marked by scars. Soon, invitations poured in from across the country. Conferences, schools, prisons, churches, community centers. Some events were small, held in gymnasiums with squeaky bleachers. Others were massive, auditoriums filled with thousands of people waiting to hear how forgiveness could transform enemies into brothers. Traveling together, they discovered something unexpected. They enjoyed each other's company. Long car rides turned into hours of conversation about faith, about family, about sports, about life. They laughed together, argued like brothers, teased each other relentlessly. What had begun as necessity now felt like friendship in its purest form. The national spotlight also brought challenges. Not everyone celebrated their story. Some accused Collins of exploiting forgiveness to rebuild his image. Others accused Jameel of betraying justice by forgiving too quickly. The criticism stung, but it also forced them to dig deeper into their why. And their why was simple: to show the world that forgiveness doesn't erase pain, it transforms it. In one of their most powerful moments, they were invited to speak inside a prison. As Collins stood before rows of men in orange jumpsuits, he admitted the truth. "I used to put men like you here, not always because you were guilty, but because I wanted another notch on my belt." The room went silent. Then, Jameel stepped forward, voice steady. "And I was one of them. But today, we stand here together to tell you, your past doesn't have to define your future." The prisoners erupted in applause. Some wept openly. Many lined up afterward to shake their hands. For both Jameel and Collins, it was one of the most humbling moments of their journey. What began in a small Michigan park had now grown into a story of national significance. A story of brokenness, justice, and the radical power of forgiveness. But even as they stood before thousands, they knew the journey was still personal. Forgiveness wasn't a speech, wasn't a headline, wasn't a book. It was a daily choice, made in the quiet places of the heart. And that choice was what kept them walking together, not as victim and offender, not as convict and cop, but as brothers bound by grace. By now, their story had become more than personal. It was no longer just about Jameel McGee and Andrew Collins. It had become a window into something larger, about justice, race, policing, and the possibility of reconciliation in a country still deeply divided. Everywhere they went, audiences brought their own questions. Some wanted to know how forgiveness was even possible. Others wanted to know what accountability should look like for broken systems. And still others wanted to wrestle with the tension between mercy and justice. Could you forgive someone without letting them escape the consequences of their actions? Jameel never sugarcoated it. He stood tall before audiences and said plainly, "Forgiveness doesn't mean it didn't hurt. Forgiveness doesn't mean I got my years back. I'll never get those birthdays, those moments, those chances with my son again. Forgiveness just means I refuse to let hate be my prison anymore." Collins added his own hard truth. "I deserved prison. I deserved to lose everything. And I did. But forgiveness is why I'm not stuck in shame forever. Forgiveness is why I get to stand here and tell the truth instead of hiding from it." Those words carried weight. They weren't theories. They weren't crafted speeches. They were lived realities. Scars made visible, pain spoken aloud. As their platform grew, invitations began to come from unexpected places. Universities wanted them to lecture about ethics. Law enforcement conferences asked them to speak about corruption and reform. Civil rights groups invited them into conversations about systemic injustice. Sometimes the rooms were tense. Police officers sat stiffly as Collins described how easy it had been to manipulate evidence. Community members crossed their arms when Jameel spoke about the years stolen from him. But as the two men spoke together, as offender and victim, as cop and convict, as brothers, walls began to crack. One powerful moment came at a panel on policing. A young black man stood up and asked Collins directly, "Why should I ever trust a cop again, after what you did?" The room grew still. Collins didn't flinch. He looked the young man in the eye and said, "You shouldn't trust a badge just because it's a badge. Trust is earned. And men like me, men who abused it, have made that harder. I can't ask you to trust the system. All I can do is admit the truth and live differently from here on out." Then Jameel stepped in. "And that's why we're standing together. Because change doesn't come from denial. It comes from confession, from truth, from real accountability." The exchange didn't solve everything, but it opened dialogue that had been locked tight for years. Their story also began sparking conversations in faith communities. Churches across the country held them up as living examples of the gospel, grace in flesh and blood. But Jameel was careful to remind people that forgiveness wasn't a magic wand. "It took me years," he said. "It wasn't one prayer, one sermon, one moment. It was a fight in my heart every day. Don't think forgiveness means you just forget. It means you choose to let God carry what you can't." And Collins reminded listeners that forgiveness didn't cancel consequences. "I lost my career, my pension, my reputation, and I should have. Forgiveness isn't an excuse. It's a second chance." Together, they spoke into some of the most heated debates of the time, about crime, race, justice, grace. They didn't have all the answers, but what they did have was undeniable. Living proof that enemies could become brothers, that bitterness didn't have to be the final word, that forgiveness could rewrite even the ugliest story. Their journey was still unfolding, but by now, it was clear. What started as a confrontation in a Benton harbor park was rippling far beyond anything either of them had imagined. The impact of their story was no longer confined to stages or headlines. It began to take root in the lives of ordinary people, in the quiet corners where bitterness had been festering for years. Letters poured in. Emails stacked up. Strangers wrote from prisons, hospitals, suburban homes, city apartments. Some messages were only a sentence long. If he can forgive, so can I. Others spilled out like confessions, page after page of pain that had been carried in silence for decades. One letter came from a woman who had not spoken to her sister in 20 years after a family betrayal. She wrote that after hearing Jameel's words, she picked up the phone, trembling, and made the call. "We cried more than we spoke," she admitted. "But for the first time in 20 years, we were sisters again." Another came from a man incarcerated hundreds of miles away. He admitted that hearing Collins confess his corruption forced him to face his own lies. "If a cop can admit to planting drugs," he wrote, "then maybe I can admit to what I've done too. Maybe my story doesn't have to end here." Families who had lost loved ones to violence reached out, some saying they weren't ready to forgive. Not yet, but that Jameel's testimony had given them hope that healing was possible. Others wrote to Collins, telling him they hated what he had done, but respected that he wasn't hiding from it anymore. The ripple effect stretched further than either man expected. After one conference, a young man approached Jameel in tears. "I was planning to take revenge on someone who hurt me," he confessed, "but hearing you tonight, it stopped me. I don't want to throw away my life for hate." Moments like these reminded them why they kept going, why they told their story even when it cost them emotionally. Forgiveness was never about erasing the past. It was about preventing pain from multiplying. Still, the road was not without challenges. Both men found themselves pulled in opposite directions. Jameel, between the demand to keep sharing and the need to focus on rebuilding his own family. Collins, between the weight of public shame and the calling to keep telling the truth. There were nights when they both wanted to quit. Nights when the speaking tours felt like opening wounds for the benefit of others. Nights when they questioned whether the cost was too high. But then the messages would come. A mother reconciled with her estranged son. A father restored to his children. A community beginning to heal from decades of mistrust. And they would remember, this was bigger than them. The power of forgiveness was not just changing their lives. It was changing lives everywhere their story was heard. And as the ripples spread wider, both men began to realize something profound. Their story wasn't about two individuals anymore. It had become a testimony to what was possible when grace interrupts cycles of hate. It was a movement, fragile, imperfect, but real. The idea of writing a book didn't come overnight. For a long time, both men resisted it. Speaking was one thing, words carried by the air, felt in the moment, then gone. But a book? That would be permanent. Ink on a page doesn't fade as easily. For Jameel, the hesitation came from fear of being misunderstood. Could people really grasp the depth of his pain by reading words on a page? Would they reduce his years of suffering into neat paragraphs, turning his prison years into nothing more than a story of inspiration? He didn't want pity. He wanted truth. For Collins, the hesitation was shame. Telling his story face to face was already hard. He could see the audience's reactions, hear their responses, feel the humanity in the exchange. But writing it down meant the world could read about his corruption over and over again. He would be exposed not just for a moment, but for as long as the book existed. And yet, the invitations kept coming. People wanted something they could hold in their hands, something they could return to, something that would last longer than a single evening in an auditorium. Eventually, a publisher approached them. The conversation was simple. Your story is bigger than you. Could help people you'll never meet. Could live on after the speaking tours end. After many late-night talks, they agreed. Not because they wanted the spotlight, not because they wanted recognition, but because they knew their story wasn't theirs alone anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever wrestled with bitterness, injustice, or guilt. The process was grueling. Reliving the past in writing was like reopening wounds that had just begun to heal. Jameel revisited the cell, the loneliness, the years stolen. Collins revisited the lies, the corruption, the moment his empire collapsed. Page after page, they poured out their pain, their confessions, their fragile steps toward forgiveness. Sometimes they argued over details. Jameel wanted to make sure his innocence wasn't lost in the narrative. Collins wanted to make sure he wasn't painting himself as a victim of his own choices. They wrestled with tone, with honesty, with how much to reveal. But through the struggle, something deeper formed. Writing forced them to trust each other in new ways. Jameel had to trust that Collins wouldn't minimize the damage he had done. Collins had to trust that Jameel wouldn't soften the truth to make him look better. The book became not just a story they were telling together, but another test of the forgiveness they were living. When the manuscript was finished, they held the pages in their hands. The crooked cop and the innocent man, their lives entwined forever in ink. The release of the book brought fresh waves of attention. Media outlets invited them back. Bookstores filled with readers eager to hear them speak. People lined up, copies in hand, asking for signatures, asking for advice, asking how to find the strength to forgive. And while the book reached thousands, what mattered most to both men was the hope that it might reach the one person sitting alone in bitterness, convinced that forgiveness was impossible. Because if forgiveness could be found in a story as broken as theirs, then maybe it could be found anywhere. When the book finally hit the shelves, neither Jameel nor Andrew fully knew what to expect. They had spoken their story hundreds of times before live audiences, but this was different. A book lived on coffee tables, in backpacks, in prison libraries, in church foyers. It wasn't bound by time or geography, could travel farther than they ever could. The first weeks brought excitement. Interviews aired on national television. Bookstores filled with people eager to hear from the two men whose lives had collided in such a devastating way. Some came for inspiration, some for curiosity, and some because they too carried wounds and wanted to know if healing was truly possible. But alongside the celebrations came the backlash. Reviews poured in, many glowing, but some harsh. Critics accused them of turning tragedy into profit. Others said forgiveness without systemic reform was hollow. Some called Jameel a fool for forgiving too easily. Others dismissed Collins as a man still running from the full weight of justice. The criticism stung. Jameel had feared this exact thing, that strangers who had never lived his pain would judge his choices. He knew forgiveness didn't make sense to everyone. But still, reading those words reopened old insecurities. Was he really free, or had he let Collins off too lightly? Collins felt the sting too. Each negative review was a reminder that his past would never be erased. No matter how many times he told his story, no matter how sincerely he confessed, some would always see him as the dirty cop who framed an innocent man. And in a way, he knew they weren't wrong. That man would always be part of his history. But for every critic, there were dozens more whose lives were being changed. Letters continued to flood in, from readers across the country and even across the world. A pastor in South Africa wrote that he shared their story with his congregation, and it inspired reconciliation in his community. A teacher in Chicago used the book in her classroom, sparking conversations about justice and grace among her students. A prisoner in Texas said reading their story gave him hope that even behind bars, forgiveness could rewrite his life. Perhaps the most powerful moments came when people approached them in person at book signings. A woman with tears streaming down her face clutched her copy and said, "My father abandoned me 30 years ago. I've hated him ever since. But tonight, I'm going to call him." A man with trembling hands whispered, "I did time for something I didn't do. Your story told me I'm not alone." These moments reminded them why they had written the book in the first place. Not to erase the pain, not to polish the story, but to give others a glimpse of what was possible when hate no longer held the pen. And yet, behind the smiles and the headlines, both men carried the same truth. Forgiveness was not a finish line. It was a daily battle. The book didn't end their journey. If anything, it magnified it. Everywhere they went, people now looked to them as the forgiveness guys. And while that label brought hope, it also carried pressure. because forgiveness wasn't something they had mastered. It was something they were still learning, still stumbling through, still choosing, one day at a time. And now, with the whole world watching, that choice mattered more than ever. In the end, their story wasn't about the courtroom. It wasn't about the police files, the prison years, or even the book that carried their words into the world. It was about two men, once enemies locked in a cycle of injustice, who chose a different path when hate could have had the final word. For Jameel, the years in prison could never be restored. No book, no speech, no reconciliation could give back the birthdays he missed, the nights he lay in a cell wondering if he would ever be free, the moments his son needed him most. That loss would always be part of him, but so would the choice he made to forgive, not because it erased the pain, but because it broke the chains bitterness had tried to wrap around his life. For Collins, the corruption of his past would never vanish. His badge was gone, his reputation shattered. He could never undo the lies he told or the lives his actions damaged. But he too made a choice. To face his guilt head-on, to confess openly, to let his brokenness become a warning and his repentance become a testimony. Together, they became living proof that forgiveness doesn't deny justice, it transforms it. Forgiveness doesn't pretend the past didn't happen. It redeems it, giving pain a purpose beyond itself. Their story rippled outward, touching prisons and classrooms, churches and community halls, families torn apart by betrayal, and strangers weighed down by decades of silence. Each time they told it, they reminded people that forgiveness wasn't about what someone else deserved. It was about freedom, about refusing to let hate have the last say. And somewhere along the way, what began as survival grew into brotherhood. The innocent man and the crooked cop, once divided by lies and steel bars, now stood as brothers, bound not by shared success, but by shared brokenness redeemed. In quiet moments away from the spotlight, they often laughed at the irony of it all. If someone had told them years earlier that they'd one day be friends, they would have dismissed it as impossible. Yet here they were, not just forgiving each other, but standing together as fathers, as men, as brothers. Their lives had been shattered, but in the pieces something unexpected had been built. Hope. And hope, once born, has a way of spreading further than either of them could have imagined. Because in the end, their story wasn't just about Jameel McGee and Andrew Collins. It was about all of us. About the grudges we carry, the wounds we hide, the bitterness we nurse in silence. Their journey stood as a reminder that while forgiveness may not be easy, it is always possible. And when it happens, when enemies become brothers, when broken stories are rewritten, the impossible becomes reality. Theirs is not a story of perfection. It is a story of grace, a story of freedom, a story of forgiveness,